I'm Jerry Pociask. I've authored the book called Hidden Lives, an Anthology. There's actually 3 stories in that anthology. The first one is When the Streetlights Went On. The second one is at End of Life, and the third one is 3 Days of Darkness. And that's kind of a memory or memoir of my growing up in Detroit and some of the good times of being a second-generation Polish immigrant to the Detroit area. My maternal and paternal grandmothers and grandfathers all immigrated from Poland. My one grandmother, who I was probably closest to, came here when she was 13. She jumped a ship, was a stowaway, came here, and when she landed, she was looking for a family, and they said Detroit. She actually started working in a cigar factory, rolling cigars. In fact, I opened the book. I talk a little bit about the era, but then I opened it with a plan for a play in a street football game. We used to play a lot of flag football. And back then, there were so many kids in the area that it was nothing to put together a sandlot baseball game, or we could literally have 2 teams in baseball, and we could have 2 teams easily in football. And so there's a lot of different things that occurred then that today you won't see. My dad had a 1955 green Chevy Bel Air that was stolen one time, and he took the back seat. The back seat was stolen, was gone, and he put down 2 milk cartons and 2 2x10s. And my 2 aunts, my sister, and I sat back there, and we drove to Holland, Michigan, from Detroit in the back seat of that car on that stool, so to speak. And the interesting part is obviously today, if the police were to catch you, that that would have been a major fine and probably jail time for having done that. But it was a different time. If you go downtown Detroit, the old J.L. Hudson building used to have what was known as the largest flag in America. And I can remember standing on the corner of Woodward trying to cross the street and looking at this huge flag that covered the 10-story, I think it was a 10-story building. There's pictures of it. Or I can remember going to the Thanksgiving Day parade, and Santa Claus would walk off of his sleigh because it was so high and walk into the 2nd or 3rd floor of one of the buildings, of one of the windows that was there. And I think that's some things that are lost. I think with my grandchildren, they want to know. They ask me questions. They asked me questions about, in fact, my first book called Call Me Grandpa was about when I got a phone call from my son saying, "You're going to be a grandpa." And I had to reflect back and say, wow, am I even a decent father, let alone to be a grandfather? Well, I think a lot of it is as you age, which I am probably older than a lot of people that you know, you start to reflect. You start to look back and say, wow, what is going to be my legacy? What am I really going to leave my kids? What am I going to leave the world? Anybody in the United States particularly, and I've talked to people in Europe, anybody that I've talked to, I say, what's the one thing your parents said when you were growing up back then? And they said, be home when the streetlights go on. And that was the timer. And if you weren't home when the streetlights came on, God help you if your father had to come get you. Second story is End of Life, and it is a story about, and again, it's set back in the start of World War II. It's a love story. It's a romance, and my father and my mother loved each other immensely, and I have nothing but grand memories of their relationship. And it's a story about a man who goes back to the hospital and talks to his now dying wife. It's a story about my father, and I did draw on some of the stories he told me, and I know that he absolutely loved my mother. And to see my mother and father, it's hard to explain the look in their eyes, or they truly loved each other. But in fact, when my mother passed away, my dad stood for probably a good 20 minutes just holding her hand at the casket and telling her how much he loved her and how he's going to miss her. And that always impressed me, and that always left an impression on me. The story is about, he goes in and he buys her flowers, and she's in ICU, and he lays next to her, and he starts to recount and recollect some of their memories. And then the story kind of switches back and forth where while she is unconscious, there's a conversation, because as he's talking to her, I believe that if a person is in a coma or unconscious and you speak to them, they can hear you. And they're not deceased yet. They can still think for themselves. And so there is a part of this book which kind of goes back and she answers him. And the only way he knows that there's any kind of reaction is that sometimes the lights blink and all that when it, from all the monitors, et cetera, et cetera. But it's essentially a romantic, nostalgic love story. I've always been a romantic. I've always liked I'm not in love with being in love, but I had a good example of my mom and dad, and you know what? It left me with good memories.
Yeah.
I'll save the end for the people who buy the book. The third one is 3 Days of Darkness. And technically, that's an actual Catholic prophecy. There is a prophecy. I think it's by Padre Pio. Don't quote me on that, please. But it's called the 3 Days of Darkness, and they're talking about the possibility of a purging or cleansing of the earth. And the story kind of goes along. So it's not macabre. It's supernatural a bit. I was an altar boy. I was the chubby cherubic kid who, was there serving Mass and all that kind of stuff. And it was interesting because I had a priest who would cut the Mass short because he loved to fish. And he always served the 6:30 Mass, or said the 6:30 Mass in the morning, because he could get done early and go fishing. Again, drawing on my memory, my thoughts, my emotions about, what's this all supposed to be all about? And then obviously, we've had movies about exorcism and all that, and this book is nothing like that at all. I don't want it that way. It's the impression of how people go through life, of things that happen to them that they never expected.
Yeah.
I'm Polish Catholic, man. Do you know how much guilt I live with? And I married an Irish Catholic woman, so you want to talk about guilt, imagine this. In the 3 Days of Darkness, and I will give you a little bit of an excerpt from the story. Imagine being in your apartment. You've got to cover the windows. You have to put salt along the threshold of the windows and the doors. You have to close everything off. There's no light, there's no heat, there's no moon, and the only thing that will work at all, a flashlight doesn't even work. The only thing that will work is a blessed beeswax candle. And for 3 days, you have to live by a lit beeswax candle. Now think of how your mind would play or wreak havoc with you, what the thoughts you would have, the things that you would try to overcome and oversee, and the memories that you would have to relive. And that's part of what the story is about. But it has a good ending as well, and I've allowed myself the opportunity of a sequel. I'm Jerry Pociask. The name of the book that I have written is called Hidden Lives. It's an anthology of 3 stories. It's available on Amazon, and you can purchase it as an ebook or in paperback.